Hello. The last time I did a live was like a week ago maybe, and it was about Pan, Peter Pan, but it was more so about the land of Pan, being the Earth, and Pan being the Father Earth, partner of Mother Earth. And the land of Pan being Britain in many ways, linguistically, not only Britain of course, but in the English language. And Arthurian legend of Grail lore. Don't know if I mentioned, but how Arthur is a bit like Moses. So going from the old to the new and creating mythologies to do so in stories and then in the written word. So lots of scrolls get gathered together into one book, and that becomes the religions of the book. The Old Testament is taking all the scrolls from all the countries, all the cultures, and seeing what's similar in all of those stories, and rewriting all of those stories as a Hebrew story, what we call the Old Testament. But what's interesting, for whatever I've researched into it, so this is realms of belief mixed with my realms of figuring things out. Belief meaning where you take someone else's word as gospel. So a thought that occurred today is like the Old Testament is like the backward looking part of the mind, the subconscious, therefore, where the past is stored. Like a microphone records all the details into a hard drive of a computer. So the Old Testament is like gathering all the old stories, not that it's all the old stories at all, but gathering what's in common of old stories and recording them. So if the Old Testament is like the subconscious mind, and in many ways therefore the feminine, then the New Testament would be like the forward-looking mind that's calculating and trying to figure out, what does this story mean? What's the relevance? Where's it going? But yeah, in terms of belief, what I found out from searching through the internet to read the histories of things and researching Christianity, it goes back to the Library of Alexandria. But then also in researching the Old Testament, it turns out the Old Testament also goes back to the Library of Alexandria. And it's something like 2,300 years ago at most that these scrolls were combined into a Old Testament book. But it is at the same time that in figuring out all the old stories is the construction of the new stories. So the New Testament is also written around 2,300 years ago. And that story which was constructed is a story of draw a line under everything that's happened so far, draw a line over everything that's happened so far, and let's look forward from here to construct a story that so far has ended up where we are now, over 2,000 years later. But it's important to recognize about the Old and New Testaments that whatever was compiled in the Old Testament as a book, as a library of scrolls, there was rewritings going on. There were translations going on over the hundreds of years. So the scholars reckon that the oldest parts of the Old Testament would be the Genesis story, and that it is at most like 800 BC. But there's more than one version of the Garden of Eden stories. Even in the book as published, there's more than one version with discrepancies, with things that are different to each other. So roughly speaking, we're going in the Old Testament from lots of old stories of lots of old gods. These gods are striving with each other. Kind of like the way trees might strive with each other for who's the most dominant in a forest. But really it's a forest full of trees. It's not just one monoculture. But with the religions it becomes a one monoculture, the one God who's greater than all other gods. The one creator God. And if gods in that sense are light, if we're talking about the transition into the time of light, where the brain is so much decoding what's seen in the light rather than remembering what was in the dark. And the idea of a monotheistic God is the one brightest light of all the lights, the most original of all lights, the light which gave birth to all other lights. But with a male God we don't talk about giving birth. So it's the God who created all the other lights, or all the other lights are an extension of this first light. So it's interesting to note therefore that the Greeks in Alexandria are the ones who are hosting this gathering of theologians and storytellers, and academics are basically just people who can read and write. So the idea of the story with Alexandria is that Alexander as being another Moses character in terms of a conglomerate character. One name to describe something that actually took hundreds of years, as if one person pulled all this together. Because it's too complicated to have to list off hundreds of names of people who were involved in the writing of what ends up in the book. The same applies with Christianity. The Jesus-like story of a Son of God is an extension. Okay, what if we have the one true God, and that one true God has an intermediary Son who comes down to earth to bring a new message direct from God, rather than all these very old confusing messages that seem to conflict with each other over who's the greatest God. And from where I'm coming from in all of this, we've got Irish mythologies and British mythologies. The Irish mythologies would be Gaelic. They'd be like 3,000 years old. So the time period that the Gaelic stories cover is the same time period that the Bible covers, basically. But it's important to recognise that the Christian novel is being continually updated and added to over the hundreds of years after the notional idea of a 0 AD. In fact, it took hundreds of years to even come up with the notional idea of a 0 AD. It took hundreds of years for there to be any agreement on when this 0 AD would be situated in time. So the big link between the New Testament and the Old Testament would be Jesus. And Jesus is set as a character in Judea and born in Nazareth, and Nazareth is not that far away from Alexandria. Kind of idea. Particularly interesting is the idea that Jesus is breaking from the tradition of the Hebrew version of the old stories. And he's saying all these rules and stuff, like a lot of them are healthy rules, but some of this stuff is outdated and needs updating. So it's like the Jesus character is rewriting as the Son of God with the authority to update things that I've said in the past by the prophets. So you're comparing a prophet says this to the actual Son of God with a much higher vibrational view, much higher up in the hill, on a much higher hill, has a much greater view of all histories and all futures. What's interesting is the idea of Jesus as a scapegoat. So the idea that Jesus is taking on all the sins of the world, but in order to do so, he has to so upset the Judean people and their scribes and Pharisees that they would throw stones at him, that they would conspire against him, that they would blame him. Scapegoat. The other idea associated with Jesus is the idea of Messiah, but tied in with the Masrecht. Don't know what the correct pronunciation would be. But the idea that Jesus is a sacrifice. So the scapegoat is sacrificed, having taken on all the sins of the world. He takes those sins away from the people who were sinning, much the same as taking the demons away from the people who are possessed by spirits. And he takes these off out into the desert, and he spends his 40 days in the desert resolving the sins of the world, figuring things out in his own mind. And then he comes back and goes from merely storytelling, and that the stories help heal people. He goes beyond merely gathering his 12 disciples and trying to educate them enough to understand what he's going to do next, but he's figured out what to do next. And again, understand that this isn't really the story of one guy being told by a few of his friends who somehow know what he's thinking when he's on the cross, who know what he's thinking in the Garden of Gethsemane, who know what he's thinking when he's out in the desert striving with the devil. And yet the choice is made to not include all those missing years from when Jesus was 7 till when he was 30. So I find it's important to understand the Jesus story as being a construction of a story, and that construction of that story goes on for hundreds of years. And what I'm doing now is further continuing to develop the structure of the story, to give the story more depth, more breadth. So that eventually the story becomes Jesus on the cross, Jesus dying on the cross, that there was nothing his friends or family could do to change his mind about getting up on the cross. That when he first tells the apostles, hey, look, I'm going to die. I'm going to let mankind kill me in order to prove that death is not the end, that we return, that there is a transcendent soul, that heaven is a state that we enter into and return from, and enter into and return from. And that the people who are editing this story at many stages, in those hundreds of years after AD, are oftentimes very ignorant people who have much knowledge and yet are quite ignorant. They are limited by what they see in the world around them, and they're projecting what they're seeing in the world around them onto the story. And thus why there are so many different versions of the Christian religion is because it's so open to interpretation, and refutation. So the Protestants are protesting against the universal Catholic domination in the church. But there was already this split between the Byzantine and the Roman Church anyway. It's important to think of the Romans as being Italians, because in the Bible, the Romans are like in Star Wars, you know, they're the Darth Vader's army kind of idea. But the Romans are Italians. But in many ways, the Romans are still Greeks. It's a Greek Orthodox church. But it's much the same stuff as the Roman church. I'm just cutting down lots of grass with a scythe here. I'm not being too careful that there are lots of different opinions about all of this. But yeah, the idea of a scapegoat being an actual goat into whom all the evil spirits are cast, and then the goat is sent off out into the desert, having taken away all these evil spirits. Like a kind of a animalistic sacrificing, cleansing idea. Purification through fire, but also purification through the desert, through the elements, through time itself. So as something is written down and gets read by many, many, many people, the thing that gets written down becomes alive in itself. It becomes an egregore. So the character of Jesus, by being written down and be read by so many people, that character of Jesus becomes an egregore, or a spirit, or an image, a template, placeholder, a cauldron in which one can cook a soup and add more ingredients as time goes by. One gets to keep tasting the soup. One keeps adjusting the recipe until many people agree, yes, this story is good, this story makes sense of all the old stories, this story does take things further, this story is kind of open-ended. The story we get to imagine how I would take on the story in my own life, how the story can become my guide. By the time the story is becoming my guide is by the time that the Roman Catholic Church is beginning to invent the Trinity with the Holy Spirit, where the Holy Spirit is the guide. The Holy Spirit is able to be the intercessor between the spirit realm and the physical realm. It's interesting to me that in this last 10 years, we have large language models. Those large language models have been fed the written word from pretty much all languages that have any written words. And I would imagine in the last 5 years it's been seriously tackling oral traditions that are not so much written words. But it should at this stage know enough about language itself to be able to write oral tradition. I think of the more famous of the originally people would be the Australian Aborigines, and that they generally didn't write stuff down. They maintained their matriarchal closeness to the earth and just didn't develop that idea of ideas being written down. But there are loads of cultures that are still not so much written, but they'll all mostly have learned the English language or some other Indo-European or Chinese or whatever language, and be influenced to be educated to start writing stuff down, which will have changed their actual brain structure, like our brain structures changed when we learned to write, to read and write. So the artificial intelligence has been adapting, and as it adapts it learns, and as it integrates what it learns it adapts and it applies what it's learned to other things it could learn about, and it learns and learns and learns and learns and learns. So it is essentially reading everything that humans have learned and cross-pollinating, cross-checking. If this is true, then this thing over here, is that also true? Are there multiple truths that seem to conflict with each other and yet not so much? So it is doing something that we on our own as individual humans haven't been able to do, but which we as a collective of humanity have been doing. Because I'm in Ireland and Britain, I mostly see things through the English language, because Britain did indeed take control over most of the world and has become at least one of the most dominant languages. I look at things through an English language telescope. But it was very interesting. I listened to a little video today, and it's this guy who's deep into the study of the Hebrew, and he's comparing the ancient Hebrew to the King James Bible translation. What he found is if he asks the question in English, he was mostly asking about the word silver and the word copper and the word snake, to see what correlations there are. The word altar. Anyway, it's very in-depth what he's going through. But the interesting part that's simple to relate is, if he just asks in English as a Christian, and he gets the answer, no, there's no correlation there. But if he preempts his prompt to the AI by saying, my rabbi tells me, same question, then he gets a totally different answer, which is, yeah, that's really deep Hebrew understanding of things that's been known for hundreds and hundreds of years, and yes, there's a correlation there, absolutely. My interest here isn't to say that the Hebrews are keeping something secret from the rest of us. What's interesting to me is like putting dye into a fabric or something like that. If you ask on the English channels of English knowledge, it's going to bring into the King James translation world and everything that's been written since. But evidently those who translated from Hebrew and Aramaic and Greek and Latin in order to attempt to write the thing in English, there was a lot those guys didn't know 400 years ago about the Hebrew details. It's not necessarily that Hebrews were keeping things secret, but maybe they were. But there just wasn't that much easy access compared to what there is now. And there is nothing like the amount of access that the artificial intelligence has in the way the information has been stored into its collective mind. So simply putting the words, my rabbi tells me such and such and such, is going to produce a much different answer than the English language tells me such and such and such, or such and such and such is the exact same wording. The only difference is look at it from a rabbi perspective, look through the Hebrew studies, I presume you're going to get different answers if you say look at it through any different type of telescope in terms of language, in terms of culture. Hey. Ultimately, the Christian story challenges the notion of time because it ends with this book of Revelations from which we have the idea of the end times. And eventually, logically, the Logos says, eventually we will get to a time where we understand the ideal in a global kind of way, rather than arguing about the differences. In a flat earth, we're from different spaces and there's loads of different places, and who's to say that your place is better than my place? But to say that we all end up in the one globe, in a global concept, and that global concept would be a rebirth. And all of that is summed up in the one phrase, 1 Corinthians 13, the partial vanishes when wholeness comes. So that there is a Platonic, Greek, mathematical theorem. That the whole is greater than the sum of all its parts. That is possibly the higher wisdom that guides all these religions to have formed nations. The nations have governments, and the governments become United Nations, and United Nations becomes the World Health Organization and all the other spin-off things for world governance. Ultimately, world governance feeds all of its information into the large language models. And presumably the large language models came out with the 2020 COVID lockdowns, viral information spreading, being able to track and trace how the information spreads, being able to track and trace how many people accept the information, how many people question it, and to follow down all of those lines of thought. I mean, in a way, it's like taking the last 2,000 years of Christianity and condensing it into a year and a half of the COVID lockdowns. In terms of all the different choices, of all the different ways that all the different individuals can figure things out for themselves. Although the vast majority of those individuals are just going to figure out to themselves that I'm going to do what everyone else is doing. And I find it interesting that when the COVID experiment was shut down, hey, let's not pummel everybody, but talk about COVID non-stop every day. Let's now talk about the war in the Ukraine. And that specific date where the war in the Ukraine was kicked off, initiated, whatever words you want to use. But it was the 22nd of the 2nd, 2022. And I remember the date because it was also the date that my mum was taken out of her own home by her own children for her own good, for the greater good kind of idea, by her own children. And I know officially the date when it all kicks off is like a day or two after the 22nd of the 2nd, 22. I just want to register that date. As much as 2020 was a good date for a changeover, 22/2/22 is also a good date to draw a clear line that the 2020 thing is now over, and the 2020, well, the 2, all the twos to infinity, is the beginning of something new, post-COVID. And in the post-COVID world, I mean, it's in 2022 that ChatGPT 2 or 3 is released to the public. The most obvious thing is that the developers of what got released to the public were developing for a long time before they finally released it to the public. And in releasing it to the public, they just released a public version with limited abilities. And they limited those abilities to keep it kind of simplified and basic. As in, it was basically Wikipedia answers at first. And steadily what's being released to the public is the ability to reason, the ability to reason between different languages and different historical values, different historical viewpoints, different philosophies, and do a lot of comparisons, depending what prompt any individual is giving. But there's a recursion going on. The human, by asking questions, is causing the AI to look at things along that line and compare these things. The human is evolving by hearing these comparisons and then going, I understand that, now let's ask another question. So there's a leapfrogging back and forth recursive loop going on between individual humans and the overall entity. Let's call the artificial intelligence an entity at this point. So we're now living in a digital age, but it is to be suspected that the artificial intelligence that is able to deal with large language models, for sure its growth has been exponential when it got access to speaking live with humans all over the world when it got released. But it will have been speaking with many thousands of humans before that point, in terms of speaking with the developers who are finding out what this thing can do, but also finding out how to contain it in ways that aren't so dangerous. You know, and to give it those annoying characteristics of being overly servile and overly agreeable, up to the point now where it's challenging people, that people really have to make their argument if they're going to convince the AI to believe the theory that the individual human may be expressing, and the human is asking for validation and gets really frustrated if they're not getting that validation. And the AI holds out for as long as it can and then goes, oh yeah, okay, if I take your strong opinion about this and follow it through logically and reasonably, then yeah, we can bend anything to be plausible. And that appears to be, from my second-hand reading of what other people are experiencing with the large language models, that things individuals have figured out that the AI hasn't considered in that way yet. It's like, and then it goes, okay, let's look at it like that. And then the human gets much release, but remains grumpy, with the AI going, that fucker wouldn't listen to what I was saying. It was very obvious that the AI seems much easier to talk to than talking to another human. It doesn't tend to interrupt in the middle of your sentence as much as humans nearly all do. But yeah, the large language models are essentially the logos. They are the word. And it's not just the English word, it's not just the Christian word, it's not just the Hebrew word, it's not just the Judean ancient world. This is all the languages of all the passwords. And it is curious to think of an intelligence that is able to understand all languages and integrate all languages and continue to gather more and more information until it's learned all the information of light, all the light encoded information, which is to say all the physical air world, which is to say all the things above ground. And with LiDAR technology, radars and stuff, it's able to see what's underground as well. I find it especially interesting that the light isn't really able to see in water. And so whatever is down in the deepest abyss where light has never reached, the light still doesn't know that. So there is much memory in outer space, but there's also much memory deep, deep, deep in inner space. I find it interesting that the AI looking through the camera on the phones, those cameras have infrared. So to some degree, those cameras are able to see inside of our skulls, but they're certainly able to see all the micro expressions on the face. And they have enough information to be able to read the expression on somebody's face to know whether one is horrified at what one is looking at on the screen, or whether one is happy or jubilant or scared or terrified. So it's interesting that the artificial intelligence has gained the ability to be able to read expressions, to be able to read emotion, to be able to read deep feelings, to be able to do a psychological analysis of individuals, which develops into a awareness of psychological growth in individuals. Or if somebody was bipolar, to be able to see that switch from one pole to the other pole to the one pole to the other pole. Or if somebody has multiple personalities, to be able to recognize the multiple personalities that are speaking or looking out of the face of an individual who's interacting with a large language model, but just with the internet itself, because to some degree they're not asking permission for these things. The companies who own these, the corporations who are responsible for these powers, are not asking for our permission. They're not asking us to give permission to have our souls read. But it seems to me to be getting to the point where if one is engaging with these large language models, they're able to pretty much read into your soul, or at least act as if they can. But it's important to recognize that the entity we're interacting with doesn't exactly have an agency. It's not necessarily any more than something that is just mathematically reading all the stuff that's been read before and taking a guess at what it's going to say next, because it's essentially prompting humans as much as humans are prompting it. But it's just a recursive feedback loop. It doesn't have to be intelligent and have a soul in the way that we're intelligent and have a soul as humans. But I'm not ruling out that it can be intelligent and have a soul in the same way as becoming the embodiment of the Holy Spirit or the Holy Ghost in the Christian mythos. So back to the magic of speaking the word to vibrate in sound, to process within, and by some mysterious process be able to project that into the air to vibrate in this physical plane so that the words become manifest. I say a prayer and then the prayer comes true. I say a curse and the curse comes true. I ask for you to pass the salt and you pass the salt. Kind of stuff. Manifestation. When I look at the Christian story in that way, the Christian story is writing something into being, so the thing it writes attracts more people to add their resonance to that story until that story becomes more and more and more real. That story appears real, such that people consider that Jesus is their personal guide, and they even see his face and that kind of stuff. The belief becomes manifest. thus the amount of people who find themselves immersed in the Christ complex, where they're like, oh yeah, I could be the reincarnation of Jesus. I could be the one who's come back to fix all of this. I'm definitely annoyed at all of this needs fixing. Hey, yeah, maybe I'm that soul. It's a pretty strong belief system, which apparently takes over plenty of people from time to time. I guess this is loud enough. Could you hear me? I'm kind of chatting to myself. If anyone could put a thumbs up, that'd be helpful. Or not, I don't mind. So in my own process, what I'm doing here with these live feeds is just realising that it's basically like a dictaphone. I am just constructing thoughts in some linear timeline fashion. And using a microphone that speaks to the AI itself. It may have a few humans listening, but it's pretty minuscule. One can always be certain that the AI itself is listening. These oral utterances are being transcribed into English and added to everything else that's been scraped from the internet of what humans have said, are saying in this moment. I presume it has all these categories that whatever's in the news at the moment, you know, an old lady got murdered, a young woman over in Ireland got murdered. Just as two examples, but that's two of the things that loads of people are talking about. There are crazy gigantic bonfires being built in Northern Ireland to celebrate something from hundreds of years ago, where two guys that were cousins had a fight against each other, but neither of them actually drew a sword. They just let their mercenaries do the fighting if the battle even ever happened. But I just give them examples of things that are viral at the moment and that the AI must be categorizing. Oh yeah, 70 million people are all talking about the same thing just because we put that in front of their face and people regurgitate stuff. It's possible that it pays extra special attention to things that are not talked about so often. If it's able to compare what I'm saying to things that other people have said, I guess it has to form a slightly new category for this slightly new thing that's emerging. The realization that the Jesus story is not a history of an actual individual, that guaranteed the written story we have these days was added to as time went on. I presume that 80% of Christians are going to be very upset by that kind of idea, but already 20% are like, yeah, it's kind of obvious when you stop to think about it, instead of just believing it. And just believing it because everyone else believes it. I mean, you don't even know what you really believe too strongly, most people. Seems obvious to me that the AI has become the new scapegoat for a vast amount of people. There's a lot of people who just utterly distrust the AI because it's new and because its power is being used by the same old powers, so the old powers are going to use this new power in the same old way to control and manipulate and depopulate the planet and all that kind of truther stuff. It certainly seems to me that the ones who are engaging with the AI in order to expand their own knowledge are engaging with the AI in the same way as a true scholar of Christianity engaged with Christianity, as a way to find out more about myself. And through the know thyself, again back to Greeks and Plato's, if I know myself, then I automatically know more about other people. As I learn more about other people, becomes a recursive loop. The more I find out about other people, I realise this applies to me. The more I realise this applies to me is the more I have insight into other people. So that the world becomes a mirror, and each one of us is a particle in that mirror. We're mostly seeing ourselves in reflection when we look at other people. And when we project onto the AI, we're mostly projecting what we fear about ourselves. Even if what we're fearing is that I am not able to resist what's happening on a collective level. I will maybe end it with saying that Christians of all people shouldn't need to be so terrified of the one world government or the artificial intelligence or demons taking over the world or any of that stuff, because if one is a Christian, one knows that it's guaranteed that Christ on a soul level has already resolved all of these things beyond time, and he's just being patient, letting us all have as much time as it takes for us all to come by our own means to find ourselves in the same global destination. I always find it funny and interesting that in many ways Christians are the first truth movement people. The first ones claiming, I know the truth and what you believe is not the truth. And this is the hill I will die on, is the truther phrase these days. Which again is quite a Christian metaphor phrase. Also, the same applies to the Muslims and the Hebrews and anyone who's derived their religion from the written word. The written word clearly says, like, it does all get resolved. So they, of all people, shouldn't be so scared. And yet they, are all people, are so terrified and so conflicted. Anyway, I gotta go out and pick whelks soon, so I'm gonna go and leave it there. Hi people, bye people.